I am glad that you are with us today, whether you are in this room that we continue to fill up, and we are so grateful for that, or whether you're joining us online. Welcome to this. We're in this series, The Story, and we're using a resource which is simply a well-crafted reading plan through the Bible called The Story. And what I would have you know is that we have given out 250 of these books so far because you keep sharing it with other people. Part of our vision, our mission as a church is we want to lead other people into becoming followers of Jesus. We're unapologetic about that. And that mission leads us into our vision, which we refer to simply in the shorthand as Vision 5. And the very first component of Vision 5 is we want everyone to lead one. And at that, as everybody is leading one, some of the ways that I'm well aware that you are leading someone else is you are distributing and giving somebody a book and inviting them to come along with us on this journey. I had a great experience last week. One of our students, Lily Polk, shared with me that she has invited 4 different friends and gave out 4 of the books to that, and they're following along. That's God at work in this, and we are so grateful. And I'm so thankful for so many of you that have been, because you're generous, and when you give into the mission of this church, things like this happen, and God uses that and blesses others. Well, I want to dive into our message for today. And I'm going to set it up this way because if you're new to faith, new to Christianity, or perhaps you've been around it for a long time and maybe you're very, very skeptical because you've got an overarching question that you've wrestled with, and for whatever reason, whatever dynamic that you've grown up in or your life experiences have been, you have yet to have a good answer to this question. And the question is simply what I'm going to title the sermon, and it's the question of chapter 4 of our story of who is God? Who is God? How do we actually get our mind around this? And why in the world should we contribute our lives, submit our lives to someone that for all practical purposes seems to be invisible? Seems to be non-present, seems to be a concept, but not a person, not an entity, not a presence in my life. And that is where this chapter, this next phase in the story is going to demonstrate the answer to this question. So if you recall from last week, we looked at the life of a man named Joseph. And Joseph, as a young man, was betrayed by his brothers, and not just any old betrayal, not just his feelings were hurt by them, but he was actually sold into slavery by them. Now, there's some sibling rivalry for you. And he is sold into slavery, and God uses that, even though it was intended for evil, he uses that to direct Joseph to arrive in Egypt, and through a series of events, some of them positive, many of them negative, God orchestrates it in such a way that Joseph rises from the level of slave to second in command in all of the nation, second only to the ruler that we know as Pharaoh. And it's in that rise that he becomes the one who directs the resources of Egypt to store up grain, because he is aware that God has told him that a famine and a drought, the likes of which they have yet to have seen, is coming, and it's going to last for 7 years, and it's going to be brutal. And through this, Egypt stores up enough grain not only to feed their population, but also to become essentially the breadbasket for the surrounding nations. Now remember, Joseph's brothers were not in Egypt. They had sold him into slavery, but they experienced the famine too, and so very quickly they need to go to Egypt. They have no idea when they go seeking grain that it's going to be their brother who decades before they betrayed. And through a series of events, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and at first They're terrified because they're afraid he's going to hold a grudge, and yet he shows grace and mercy on them, and he has them bring their families to Egypt because they can be cared for there. Well, and this goes on, and their families continue to grow and grow and grow, and generation after generation, they multiply, and God is bringing true what he's already promised previously in our story. God is bringing true the fact that he's going to take, through a man named Abraham, he's going to create a nation of descendants. And so this nation is growing inside the nation of Egypt. Well, as you jump into chapter 4, and when you read chapter 4, you're going to see a phrase very early. It says, "Then came a Pharaoh who knew nothing about, who cared nothing about Joseph." And so what's happening is, what happens to us oftentimes is we forget our own history, don't we? There can be something that happens, that occurs, that's a crystallizing and a catalytic event that brings us all together, and we say, we will never forget. And yet, as time goes on, we start to forget. And we lose sight of either that very positive thing that happened or that very negative thing that happened, and we swear we won't make those mistakes again. And so a Pharaoh comes to power that either doesn't remember, doesn't know, or doesn't care about who Joseph is. All he knows is that now, under his reign, he has this growing nation of people, and he's afraid of an uprising because they are holding on to their ethnic identity. And so what does he do? He begins to bring them into harsh labor, and he starts to ratchet up the labor that they're required to do, and they become more and more from citizens to servants to bondservants to slaves. And over time, they are just in this captivity, in this bondage they have. And that's how chapter 4 opens. And what you're going to see is, when you read through chapter 4, is that God's going to do a series of deliveries. He's going to show up, and he's going to do some things. And there's going to be this idea that God shows up and he acts and he delivers. And each time he does that, he's answering the question, who is God? And so the Pharaoh that continues to fear about this people that's growing at a birth rate that he can't believe and can't control, he starts to enact some policies to try to rein this in. And so it ultimately becomes this brutal policy. His birth control, his population control mechanism is that he sends out the edict that whenever a Hebrew child is born, the midwives are instructed, if it's a girl, it's a female, they're allowed to live. If it's a male, however, the midwives were to take the child and cast the child into the Nile. That would have been some strange form of almost worship of the god of the Nile, but it would have been the means by which he's going to control the population. And can you imagine the psychological effect if you're the oppressed nation, that the governing body above you has the power to steal your male children? Well, into the story is a child that's born, and their parents do not want to comply. As you can only imagine, no parent would. And so the mom, instead of putting him in the Nile just to drown, actually, in some ways, technically fulfills the requirements, but when she places this child into the Nile, she puts him inside of a small basket that's covered in such a way that it's waterproof, and actually sets the child afloat in the Nile and assigns his older sister to keep an eye on it. And she watches the basket, and the basket goes down the Nile. It gets caught in some reeds and some, what I would call growing up, the cattails. And there it's found. And it just so happens that it's found at the very spot, it's caught in the very spot that of all people, Pharaoh's daughter, the Pharaoh of the one who had issued the decree, goes down with all of her attendants to bathe, and she finds this basket with a child in it. And this is where the sister that watches, she comes she steps out, and she offers her services. And what begins at this moment is one of our first things that I want you to be aware of, and I want you to be watching for when you read this week, when you read chapter 4, is that God's going to have the series of where he shows up and he delivers. And the first person he delivers is God delivers Moses. And this is the moment where God begins his delivery of Moses. And so here's what God has orchestrated. Moses' sister steps out and she tells Pharaoh's daughter this. That she asks him this, and this is Exodus chapter 2, verse 5. She says, "Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and I get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' She says," this is Pharaoh's daughter, "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me. I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." Is that not incredible? The Pharaoh sends out the decree that all children that are male should be cast into the river and basically drown. Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and decides to take her as her own son. And so not only is Moses delivered, Moses is spared, but God arranged in such a way where Moses, for the very formative beginning years of his life, actually has a relationship with his mother. And his mother's paid to be the mother. Only God can work this out. And then Moses both has a connection with his mom as well as grows up in Pharaoh's house and receives the name because Pharaoh's daughter says, "I'm going to call you Moses because I drew you out of the water." Now, just keep that image in mind as we go through. But that's not the last time that God delivers Moses. Because Moses grows up and he's aware of both his Egyptian connections as well as his Hebrew Israelite roots. And so he continues to grow. And one time he's aware as a young man, he's aware that he's not in the same place that all of his Hebrew brothers and sisters are. And so he's out surveying the land, the nation at one point, and he sees a slave master, an Egyptian slave master, mistreating a Hebrew. And he goes into action. He feels compelled by this injustice, and so what he does, he ends up killing this Hebrew slave master. And then he goes and hides the body. He thinks that in some way maybe this is how God can possibly use him, but he also has great regret and fear when he does that. And the next day when he's out riding the same route perhaps, he encounters two Hebrews fighting, and he wants to be the peacemaker between these two Hebrews. And so he looks at them and says, "Why are you fighting? You need to get along." You know, this always works when mom and dad show up and say, "Stop fighting, brothers and sisters." And one of them turns to him and says, "What are you going to do? Are you going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday?" And Moses has this panic about him, because what he thought he was able to do in secret has been seen, and he now fears that word's going to get out. So Moses flees, and you will read in the chapter where it says, "And Pharaoh is angry." This one that had grown up in his house now has shown an act of betrayal. And so Moses doesn't just leave town, he leaves the nation. And he goes out to a place called Midian, and there, without the trappings of royalty, without an entourage, without all the other comforts that he'd known, he encounters a group of shepherds. He's gone from the palace to a group of wandering shepherds. He meets a family. He marries into the family. And he then begins the next phase of his life where he's gone from the palace to simply being a shepherd. And every morning it's the same. He gets up and he goes and he tends the sheep. He comes home at night to his family. He gets up, he goes and he tends the sheep. He gets up, he goes and tends the sheep. He gets up and he goes, tends to the sheep. None of the luxuries, none of the drama that was before, just simply this routine life. And so it is in this that suddenly one day, something different happens in that very structured order. Because he gets up, he goes, he tends the sheep, and while he's tending the sheep, he looks up on the side of a mountain, and he sees this strange event, and it's a bush that's on fire, yet as he watches it, because bushes being on fire is nothing new, except this one just kept burning, and actually it wasn't actually burning, it was just on fire without ever being consumed. And so he's curious, because at least here's something that's different than every other day that's preceded it. And he goes up and as he approaches the bush, he then hears the Lord talk to him and says, "You're now standing on holy ground." And he gives Moses a mission at that point. He says, "Moses, I have heard the cry of my people, and I have felt their cry, and I will now do something about it. And I'm going to send you to Pharaoh to tell him that now's the time to release my people, to allow them to come and worship me. I'm going to deliver them." And Moses has this conversation with God. And remember, Moses is now going to ask the question that many of us have asked. And as he receives this thing, he asks God, and in Exodus 3:14, we get this. God says to Moses, or Moses says, "Who are you, Lord?" Moses asks the question, "Who are you? How do I even begin to describe you?" And this is the response that God gives. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." Now, at first, that's almost like, what? That's almost kind of like a Yoda speak. I am who I am. And God is doing something very profound there. God is saying, who I've been, who I am, and who I will always be is consistent. The struggle is that you and I, we don't know anybody in our lives that's 100% consistent. Because if you've ever had any kind of disappointment from anyone else in your life, it's because for at least a moment, they cease to be consistent with either who they are or who you thought they were. And God begins answering this question, I am the one who has been, is, and forever will be, and it's consistent. In fact, this is the word where we get, maybe you've heard of the phrase Yahweh. I'll say, this is where that comes up, and I'll show you this is how we develop this. Yahweh, another slide, is the I am, and the way that is represented in the Hebrew, now I'm not going to put the Hebrew letters, but the English letters up here is the YHWH. Maybe you've seen this before. How we get the word Yahweh is from the word Jehovah. We go back and put some vowels in there because it's really unsure exactly how this was ever pronounced. But this name shows up again and again in your scriptures. Now you may say, I don't think I see it that much. But if you have an English copy of the Bible, one of the clues that you know that it's the personal name of God is when you see the phrase Lord in all caps. You will see the word Lord also with a capital L and lowercase O-R-D. That's the Greek word Adonai. And that's the word for Lord as well. But this, when you see it this way, it's the translation of God's name. And God is answering the question of who am I? And I am the one that is consistent. And Moses continues the conversation with God. He gets the name, but he says, well, basically, okay, that's who you are, but now I don't trust myself. He says, God, I'm not the one. In fact, Moses in some ways says, I tried this earlier. I tried to do something on your behalf, and it went terrible. And now I'm out here in the middle of the desert. I don't speak well. You need to pick somebody else. And see, so God had to deliver Moses from his own self-doubt and his own self-reliance. That's the second way that God had delivered Moses, from his own self-doubt and from his own self-reliance. Because at one point in his life, Moses thought he's large and in charge. And that proved to be not true. And now he's out in the middle of the desert. And he's gone from child of Pharaoh to leading some sheep around the wilderness. And you can imagine day after day after day after day feeling like I am simply lost out here and the Lord has even forgotten me. And now God wants to see me back in. Now he has self-doubt. And self-reliance and self-doubt are both different sides of the same coin, aren't they? That God could want to do something in your life. That God could want to do something powerfully through you. And you're going to call on one of these things, well, it's not for me to do. I'm not capable. I'm not smart enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm not charismatic enough. I'm not cool enough. I'm not whatever to do. And all you're doing is you're claiming a self-reliance, because what Moses needs to learn and be delivered from is what we need to learn and be delivered from is it's not you when God calls you. It's what he can do through you. And so here's Moses. 40 years he grew up, we learned, in Pharaoh's house. And now we believe he spent another 40 years out in the desert. And there's a famous quote by Charles Spurgeon that says this: Moses spent 40 years thinking he was somebody, 40 years learning he was nobody, and then 40 years discovering what God can do with a nobody. See, it's not you. I love, if you're familiar with Bethy Hamilton, the surfer that, as a 13-year-old surfer, lost her arm in a shark attack. And then from that, because she had a faith and because she trusted what God can do, there became this incredible platform. That's where the movie The Soul Surfer came from. And she is quoted saying, I have been able to embrace more people with one arm than I could ever have imagined with two arms. Because that's what God can do. Here's Moses at the age of 80. God calling him for the part that's going to be his legacy. His legacy is not that he was once somehow in Pharaoh's palace. His legacy is he's going to be used to deliver God's children. And Moses comes and fulfills that. If you're in that later half of life and you're still inhaling air and oxygen, God's not done with you yet. Okay? Later today, we're going to celebrate Callista Waller's birthday. She's 90 years old. She's right there. Callista, give us a wave, please. God's not done with Callista yet, and he's not done with you. She's an incredible encouragement to me and all those that know her, and I'm so grateful that she's a part of our church. But it can't come through your self-reliance, but what God can do and what God can deliver you from. So I'm going to move quickly through this next part. God delivers his people. Moses and Aaron go, and you're going to read the story where they go, they confront Pharaoh. And this is the classic, Pharaoh, let my people go. And Pharaoh asked the question. They go and they confront Pharaoh. They said, you need to release God's children, the Israelites, to go and worship him. And Pharaoh's first response is this. Exodus chapter 5, Pharaoh says, "Who is the Lord?" There it is. He's asking the same question. Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Now, as you read the story, Pharaoh says, "Who's the Lord? Why should I obey him?" God's about to respond with, "I'll show you." You will read, when you read chapter 4, that there's a series of events that have come to be known as the 10 plagues. And these are natural, supernatural, cataclysmic storms and events that are no fun. They're brutal. And it's essentially that God says, "Welcome to class." And God's going to send a 10-part correspondence course on who he is. Class is in session. And it begins with Moses, and he goes out near the Nile, the place where they had thrown so many Egyptian male children before. And through a work of God doing, the water becomes blood. And then it becomes frogs start coming up out of the Nile. And then you get gnats and flies, and you get hail and the darkness of the sky, and it just goes on. There's locusts. All these natural forces get revved up into an unbelievable way. And what we don't catch sight of is that each time something happens, it is a direct confrontation between God, Yahweh, and one of the gods of Egypt. They're believed to be a lord of the Nile, a lord of frogs, a lord over the land, a lord over the sky. And every time that God enacts one more plague, it's one more direct challenge to show who is God, who will be God. And there's this incredible push-pull and tension and drama, because what happens is Moses continues to wrestle with this, and because the people, the Israelites, most of the time they're spared from the direct effects of it, but where they're not spared is every time that Pharaoh, you think he's about to let them go, what he does is he changes his mind. And then when he changes his mind, he ramps up the pressure on the Israelites. It's basically this bad standoff that we've got going. And so the Pharaoh keeps making it more and more difficult. And he increases the brick quota that they need to produce every year and each day, and how much they need to build. And then he makes them do it without their own straw. They have to go collect their own straw. And he just makes it worse and worse. And they begin to cry out, "Why are you doing this to us, Moses?" Why? What seems really strange for people in slavery to say that. But this is going to begin a pattern where they continue to wish they were back in slavery again and again. And what you need to know is each time God is answering the question of who he is for them as well. This is why in Exodus chapter 6 you get this. One of the times after they complain, Moses and God have this conversation. God says, "Therefore say to the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I will free you from being slaves to them, and I will redeem you with an outstretched and mighty axe of judgment." Now, before we go too quickly, do you see what God says? I will free you from being slaves. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and mighty axe of judgment. God's going to claim again and again that he's doing this. Next slide. I will take you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give you to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I will give it to you as a possession. I am the Lord. Once again, all uppercase. God's saying, this is what I do. It is my acts, my might, my power, my salvation, my deliverance. Why does he need to also teach them? Because again, as God delivers his people, he's not just teaching Pharaoh something, he's teaching his own people something. And what's he teaching them? Because they have fallen in love with captivity. God delivers the Hebrews from the comforts of captivity. Now, that may seem like a strange thing to say, but it's that dynamic that when you get so comfortable with where you are, that you get so comfortable that it's easy to start thinking that this is as good as it's ever going to get. And they started believing in the power of the Egyptian gods as well. And it's hard to blame them, because you understand, if you're the one in captivity, it looks like all the other gods have all the power because you're the oppressed one. And they begin falling in love, strangely enough. And what you need to know is that God delivers them from that, because the same is true for them as for us. Is it's easier to fall in love with the bondage that we know than the freedom that we have yet to experience. Because that's always going to be deceptively more attractive that way. So some of you wrestle with addictions. And even though you would call it bondage, you realize that there's something comforting in that. It seems like it's always there for you when you need to go to it. Or maybe you're stuck in bitterness, and you realize that you're bitter about some hurt or some wound. Maybe it's incredibly grievous that was inflicted upon you a long time ago, but you realize that it's eating you up from the inside, but that is still more attractive than the freedom of forgiveness, because you have no idea what that's like, and that's scary to offer it out. And you may get hurt all over again. We tell ourselves stories that this is the way the world works, and I'm just trapped in it, because it would be far more vulnerable and scary for us to step out and explore and experience the freedom that God has to offer. And so this is what he is delivering them from. They come to the last plague. The last plague is known as the one of Passover. And once again, this has been pitted, God against Egypt again. So in Exodus 4:22 says this: Pharaoh, say to Pharaoh, this is what the Lord says: Israel is my firstborn son. God calls this nation his firstborn son. And I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son. And so there comes these instructions that the angel of the Lord is going to pass over the entire nation. And he's going to take the firstborn of every household, whether it's Pharaoh's household or a prisoner's household, it doesn't matter, across the nation, even of the livestock as well. This is going to be brutal. And there's instructions given that those that want to escape and be delivered from this are to put the blood of a sacrificed lamb on their door. And as the Lord passes over, those that are under the protection of the blood will be spared. Exodus 12:12 says this: On that same night, I will pass through Egypt, and I will strike down every firstborn of both people and animals. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. God does what he says. And that night, there is wailing across the nations. And as Pharaoh wakes up to find out his own firstborn has died. He goes to Moses, says, "Go, leave me. Enough of this." And Israel, not just with their freedom, but with the spoils of war, gold and silver and jewels, they begin and they leave. And God leads them very uniquely. He leads them to a particular spot, and it pins them in between the Red Sea and the desert. And Pharaoh sees that, and he has a change of heart, and he says, "No, it's not going to end this way." And he orders his army, his entire army, to go in pursuit. He uses his best chariots. These are his best fighters. And he goes to pursuit. And Israel sees the army coming, and they see the desert on one side. They see the sea on the other. They see Pharaoh's army, and they become afraid once again. And they think they've just been led out here to die. And then God performs one more miracle, and he parts the waters. And they go across on dry land, and then God allows the Egyptians to pursue them. And after every Israelite's across, the Egyptians make their way down into this very dramatic scene. And then God releases the waters back, and he drowns the Egyptian army. Now, there's something that I came across when I was learning this, and the cool thing about it is you go back into Scripture, you always see new things about it. When Aaron and Moses had their first contact with Pharaoh, Aaron threw down his staff and transformed it into a snake, and this was a sign of power. And then the Egyptian magicians came out, and for some reason they're able to do that trick too. The one difference being the Aaron's staff, that snake, swallows the other snake. This is how it says. Each one threw down his staff and it became a snake, but Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. This is how it begins. When you go right after this event, Miriam sings a song that includes the phrase where God swallows up the Egyptians. And it's the same word. It begins with this word and it ends with this word. This is what God is doing. We're going to end how we began. Class dismissed. The lesson is over. And his people have been delivered. And so now, and I love this quote, the God who saved them in the Exodus is still worshipped today, while the gods of Pharaoh are nothing more than artifacts in museums. You can go see the gods of Pharaoh today. Just pay for a ticket. They're behind glass. And yet we still worship Pharaoh today. And here's the last point, is God delivers you. Because on that night where God said, I want you to put the blood under, he gave very specific instructions and said, you're going to eat a meal together. And under the protection of the blood, you're going to eat a meal that talks about the bitterness. And you're going to remind yourself, because you cannot forget your history. And then this meal, I want to be repeated again and again and again and again every year. Always reliving it, reclaiming that I am the God who delivers. I delivered you and I continue to deliver you. And this meal gets passed all the way down till early in the very first century as we keep time. There was one named Jesus that while he was facing a Roman execution, Scripture in the Gospel of John tells us that while he's being led to a cross, he's being led at the same time while lambs are being prepared for the sacrifice of the Passover meal. And then we get these scriptures that we're going to end with. 1 Corinthians 5:7 says this, for Christ, our Passover Lamb, has been sacrificed. And now God's ultimate plan of deliverance is revealed. With the backdrop of the Exodus, this whole story plays out. He says, this is what it was all about. I am the same God then, I am the same God now, and I am going to deliver. But here's the big difference. Before, I was protecting my firstborn. Now, I will lay down my firstborn, for the blessing of the world. And so in Ephesians, and this is how we'll end, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. I can't wait for you to read chapter 4. Because it is the entire backdrop to God's salvation mission to deliver you. Every week we share in a meal once again. And I want you to see that meal as the reminder that God is who he was and will do what he's promised to do. And whatever bondage you find yourself in, that you know that there is freedom under the power of the blood. Let me pray for you. Father, thank you that you are who you are and that you deliver. Father, may you demonstrate to yourself to us in all the ways when we wonder and we question who you are. Would you show up and remind us of what you've done in our lives and what you have promised to do, and that you are the God that keeps all that he's promised. It's in the name of Jesus, the Passover Lamb, that I pray. Amen.